So I did my undergrad in graphic design, and I was always interested in data visualization. So when I came for my master's at OCAD in the Digital Futures program, I was very compelled by information and communicating information. So as Sarah mentioned, I worked as a research assistant in the visual analytics lab, and there I was working on a lot of the data from the Globe and Mail to create interfaces, and that was a really good experience in trying to communicate very vast amounts of data. And I think a common trend that I see through all of these presentations is sort of the meaningful impact that information can have, and the importance of communicating information, especially in an age where so much of our interactions, so much of our access to information is mediated through a computer or through a mobile device. So that's sort of just like a broad overview of my background. So I'm going to be talking about my graduate thesis. And as I mentioned, I had some experience working with large data sets through my research assistantship. And for my thesis, I wanted to use big data, but I was also interested in making it a little bit more personal. Because we were working with user data in the lab and looking at how advertising taste groups can be sort of connected, but I was really interested in the personal aspects of data and specifically in social media data. So my thesis basically explores the expansion of social media, personal data collection, and the potential of understanding relationships from the perspective of social media interactions. I use methods from research through design and autoethnography in order to create iterative prototypes of interactive data visualizations that draw from all of the messages sent between my sister and I through Facebook. This thesis is an intentional exposition of seemingly private virtual conversation in order to highlight the archival nature of the internet, as well as to understand how data visualization can reveal the ways in which Facebook has been used as a tool to help maintain the relationship between my sister and I over changing distance and time. The data set spans from the very first message sent by my sister in 2010 to the end of December 2018. So my motivations in undertaking this sort of research project was prompted by my awareness of the steady growth in social media usage over time, the vast amounts of personal data collected by social media platforms, and my interest in exploring how personal social media data can illustrate people and their relationships as they're presented on the internet. This is a chart from We Are Social, which is basically like a social media analytics company. It's analyzing basically the growth in social media users, and you can sort of see that there is an annual growth worldwide. Also, research conducted by the Ryerson Social Media Lab found that in 2017, 94% of Canadian internet users had a social media presence. So that is a large majority. This report also found that Facebook was the most popular platform among Canadians. According to a report from We Are Social and Hootsuite, so this chart, in 2018, more than 3 billion people around the world use social media at least once a month. The chart shown on the slide is from that report and represents the annual growth of social media users by country. According to these statistics, Canadian social media users grow by 9% annually, and social media users in the States grow by 7%. The global average of annual growth of social media users is 13%. So many social media's privacy policies often disclose that all of the interactions and content posted on the platform in question will be collected. Facebook has stated that the company collects data about things people do, share, and who they connect with, as well as data about the devices people use to access Facebook. In today's world, it should be assumed that any free service provided through the internet is at the expense of the collection of personal user data, and every social media privacy policy that I read as part of this research mentioned the collection of personal data. My awareness of growing social media usage and personal data collection led me to become interested in exploring how user data could tell a story about people and the way they interact online. I was curious what I might be able to learn by exploring my personal social media. So, as someone who began using Facebook, which was the first social media account I ever had in 2008, I believe it was, I constantly felt the presence of social media growing in my life. And I felt that it really did mediate the interactions I had with people, and it mediated the way I socialized. So I sort of grew up using the internet and using it to connect with people. And when I started thinking about this project, I began to think about who I interacted with the most online. And not only that, who was the most important social relationship in my life, like for most of my life. And so a little bit of our background. I'm the older sister, and my sister was born 15 months after me, so we grew up very closely. We were homeschooled until high school, so we were close. We were each other's most important social relationship, I would say. And so for grad school, when I moved away 2 years ago, was the first time we ever lived apart. So I was sort of dealing with feelings of homesickness as well in the beginning of this research. So I wanted to bring him back home in a way. So this was sort of my way of connecting a little bit more to her. And I also have to say that I'm very grateful to her for consenting to participate in the data. Because we don't necessarily consent to having our data collected by Facebook, but me visualizing our private social media messages is sort of, it is very revealing, so I'm grateful to her participation. So this leads me to my research questions. In what ways can a visualization of my Facebook message data show how social media is used to maintain a relationship with my sister across changing distances in time? How can data visualization help me learn more about the online connection between my sister and I? So some theoretical areas, and this is sort of like grad school stuff, but the idea of identity, relationship, and sister bonds, technology as an extension of self, analysis of social media, and privacy and personal data collection were all sort of big themes in my research. And another important influence to my thesis was this writer, Judith Doneth, and she has this concept of hyperpublicity. She writes in her book, The Social Machine, that hyperpublicity is the idea that in addition to people seeing your actions online, those actions are recorded and archived and can be recalled over extended periods of time and shown in different contexts. In my process of researching and creating prototypes from the Facebook message data, the concept of hyperpublicity becomes crucial to consider. Additionally, Judith Doneth's book as a whole was very important to my thesis, as it addresses visualizing social relationships online, as well as using personal data to create a portrait of a person. Someone else who was influential in my research was Catherine Hales, and she's a writer and thinker who's been dealing with these ideas of humans' interaction with technology and how technology impacts our lives. And she has this concept of technogenesis, which is the idea that technology and humans co-evolve together. And that was also an important idea for me to think about as me and my sister Zoya increasingly use Facebook as a medium for communication, in many ways to serve as a substitute for face-to-face communication. And also, as part of my research, I looked at sociological studies about sibling communication and relationships, so how adult siblings interact with each other and the frequency of communication between adult siblings, and what factors might impact increase in communication. I also looked at sociological studies about construction of identity amongst siblings, so those were interesting articles and research that sort of spoke to co-construction of identity. So how there might be narratives in a family that sort of dictate, if this sibling has been assigned this trait of being bold and outgoing, then there might be a narrative that is placed on the other sibling where that sibling is seen as the quiet and shy one. So there's this sort of co-construction of identity through a comparison contrast. my methodologies, more grad school stuff, autoethnography, self-reflection, situating my own lived experience as part of the research, and research through design, which allowed me to use data visualization techniques, specifically like the ones outlined by Ben Fry, who's a data visualization researcher and important person, as well as iterative prototyping. So through that methodology, I was able to go through a series of prototypes to sort of figure out the ways that using data visualization might help me to understand the data set better. So the beginning of the process started with downloading the actual data. And this is something else that is an interesting component of this research, because I think I started doing this at a time when Facebook was sort of trying to present itself as more transparent because of, I don't know if you guys have heard, there's a lot of court cases recently and just like scandals in general to do with Facebook data. So they've recently made it possible for users to download their own personal data. And this, anyone can do this. You can go into your Facebook account in your settings and request a copy of all of your data. And it takes a while. It takes like a couple hours to a couple days, depending on how much data there is. And it's basically a zip file of all of your messages, all of your photos, all of your posts, any group that you're part of, how many times you might have unfriended someone even. So that's all part of the data set. So for my research, I sort of I looked through all of the data, but I discarded the ones that were not relevant to my topic. So I focused on the JSON file because it's in a JSON file format of the message history between my sister and I. So this is my first prototype. This was a network graph, and my goal with this prototype was to sort of figure out the most frequent messages sent between my sister and I. So disregarding time, disregarding like location or anything like that, and just visualize the most commonly sent messages between us, and also visualize the trigger messages. So the messages that were sent prior to the most common message, to sort of see, okay, what sort of situations make us respond OMG, or what situations make us respond LOL, which obviously are common messages. And this prototype was important because it sort of allowed me to figure out what my research wasn't. So if you recall, my research questions were sort of focused on how time and distance affects communication between us on Facebook. And so this completely disregards time, and it also disregards distance. So this ended up not being the path that I chose to go with this thesis, but it was important for me to just go through it and figure out how to even learn D3, because I was using D3 for this, and it was a very steep learning curve. Because I've been coding a little bit, but JavaScript was sort of foreign to me still. So I sort of learned JavaScript along with D3, so it was an interesting process. So my second prototype sort of does try to incorporate time and distance now. So this is just a wireframe, it's a black and white wireframe, so it was never actually functional. But it was just me planning out how I might be able to show conversation history over time. So this is a mirrored area graph, and also in this part of the prototyping process, I began to think about sentiment analysis. So how could I start to look at each message and sort of see if it's a positive, negative, or neutral message. So that sort of began the conversation with Sarah Diamond and a PhD researcher at the lab, Grace Mariano. And so they sort of, because I was very apprehensive about sentiment analysis, and they were like, no, it's fine, it's possible. Grace Mariano actually helped me with an R script to run on the data set to assign sentiment values, which was very helpful. And then, so finally, prototype 3. So this is still a mirror chart. It's not an area graph any longer. It's actually a mirrored bar chart. And each message is stacked on top of each other in a time frame. So all of the time is broken up into months. And each message is assigned a color to show the emotional value of that message. And when I started creating this prototype, I thought, okay, what if you could actually make the legend interactive? So you could toggle on or off certain emotions to isolate maybe if you only wanted to see the joy or if you only wanted to see the sad messages. Another thing that I really wanted to emphasize with my thesis was being able to hover and read through each message, because going back again to that idea of the hyperpublic, this was supposed to be very intentional in showing actually the contents of the messages. I wanted to make it personal. And when I was exhibiting this, it was actually interesting because so many people felt uncomfortable going through this visualization and interacting with it, because they were like, I feel like I'm going through your private life, I don't want to touch it, and it was always me being like, no, it's fine, let me show you the worst message. So yeah, I got off my notes, I don't even know where I am. Going back to color, as Sarah Diamond mentioned before, I just wanted to mention the color usage in this was based on research by DeAndretti. So the research article in particular that I was looking at was the colors of emotion. So just a quick note about that. That research found that low saturated colors that are darker are often associated with negative emotions, while higher saturated colors that are brighter are associated with more positive emotions. So, and I also was looking mostly at advertising standards, just the most generic sort of associations with color that people have. And it's not accessible for colorblind people, and that's something that I had to consider as well in the research and in the visualization. So when it came to creating accessible versions of this, because there's 11 emotional categories, to do it in a grayscale was difficult to determine and see the differences in grays. But I did create a version of this that was just a grayscale to make it more accessible. But yeah, 11 emotional categories that are very different in tone. It was definitely a challenge and not ideal for making it accessible. So for the installation, so I don't, you have a question.
Sorry, I was just wondering how you ended up with these categories, because some of them are kind of positive and joy, what was something that was positive? Yeah.
Oh, okay, so sentiment analysis. So so I'll just kind of walk through the process of how Grace did that, and then how I sort of cleaned up the data as well. So in the R script, there's this tidy text library that basically is a generic library of a bunch of emotional words. So it categorizes certain words into certain emotional categories and then compares all of the words in a message to that library. And then whichever is the most present in that message, so if you have a bunch of happy words in one message, that message would be assigned a happy category. So those sentiment groups were determined by the tidy text library. So that's not something that I really decided on my own. It was more the tools and resources that were at hand. But definitely, if I were to do something like this again, I think I would want even a wider variety of emotion types, because 11 is it's a lot, but that's still limited. There's still such a bigger variety of flavors in humans' emotional life. So that's definitely something that I would add on to. Okay. So for my program at OCAD, we have an installation that's part of the final showing of your thesis research. So for the installation, I decided to print out the entire visualization as a huge poster. So I basically split it up into two, and it was a very tall poster. It was like from here to all the way down to the floor. And the purpose for doing that is I think it's hard to see the scope of it if you're just scrolling through the visualization on the web. But seeing it physically in a poster format and seeing it all at once sort of really drives home the differences in the early years and how much messages spike over time. Another thing that it allowed me to do was to add more annotations to the axes. So this is sort of a close-up. It's hard to see still because this would have been printed like much larger and it's hard to see on the screen. But I had some annotations over the time axes, over the color legend, and over the x-axis to sort of help describe to a viewer a little bit more about what this is showing you. Also in the y-axis for the time, for the months, I had short summaries of what big events were happening in that time frame, just to sort of like contextualize it a little bit more, rather than just having like these bar graphs that are different colors, which doesn't say a lot if you don't know what's going on in the messages. And this is just an image of the final installation. So a user could go through the entire website and interact with it, as well as reading the summaries on the y-axis on the posters. And it was really interesting to get people's feedback on it because, like, on one hand, some people had no idea why I was doing this. They were like, what's the point? And so my answer to that was always like, well, so many of us are online right now. So many of us are interacting socially online. Like, that has to have an impact on our world, and that has to have an impact, like, somehow. And this is sort of just my sort of first step to comprehending that and trying to communicate, okay, this is actually the scope of how much we're using the internet. And then other people would be like, well, this could be an interesting therapeutic tool. Like if you had like a relationship therapist sort of analyze the conversation history between two people, like for example in couples therapy, you could sort of see what is going on in each time frame and maybe sort of start to unpack that. So yeah, that's it.
So next time you go to the therapist, bring along a chat history.
Yeah, yeah, all your chats. Have them analyze it.
Are there questions?
Any questions?
I was wondering what tool did you use to analyze the data?
So I kind of used a bunch. So going through the data set in the JSON format, I was just like reading it first, like just reading the data. And so for that I was just like using like a text editor, like, and then actually starting to prototype visualizations, I was using Tableau, which is like a quick sort of prototyping tool that allows you to see the results of the data. And if you guys don't have access to it yet, there's a free version for students, so you should definitely look up Tableau. And then after going through Tableau, I was starting to use d3.js, which is the JavaScript library that Matt, the presenter before, mentioned. So I used that for the final visualization, was the d3.
So you didn't use it all like SQL or?
No, it's all JavaScript.
You use SQL when there is some database.
Yeah.
With your like file installation, what kind of inspired like this mapping between like the specific mappings between colors and emotions? Like how do you come to those kind of like, oh, this color is definitely anticipation, right?
Yeah, so it was based on the research that I mentioned before, DeAndre's, the colors of emotion, and also just like industry standards. So when I say industry standards, it's like in advertising there are specific colors that you assign to specific types of advertisements to inspire a certain emotional response. So anger, I think culturally we can sort of understand is an angry color. and I'm not saying that that's the same for every culture, because obviously all cultures have different understandings of color, but for this audience, I was specifically thinking, okay, like what kind of advertisements do we see with certain colors and certain emotional responses? So, like there were some easy ones for sure, like red, sadness, like negative, what else was easy? Like disgust was pretty easy. It's like a rose mustard color. So yeah, but other ones were a little more arbitrary, and it was more like my designer like feeling about that. So it's not super scientific, that's for sure. But you know, at the end of the day, you just have to sort of put colors somewhere. So I just tried to make it as strong of a contrast as I could. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I was just wondering, you said that privacy was also like something that was related to this. I was wondering how that came into your thesis, and also if, you know, getting that awareness has changed the way you personally use social media in any way?
Mm-hmm. So I think, well, I was always sort of aware of the privacy like issues with the internet. Like all our moms say, you know, whatever you post on the internet stays there forever. And I think it was definitely interesting for me to see like how much of it is archived. Like it's really so nostalgic almost, going through all of these things that you posted when you were 13 years old and being like, wow, I'm such a different person now. But I don't think it's changed the way I use the internet. I feel like I grew up being a very public person, and sort of just like being upfront about things. So I don't think that it's changed the way that I use Facebook at all. Yeah.
Do you have any plans to take this like another step forward, or is it just like you're done with it?
Oh, I definitely want to do more things with it, because the time constraints of this sort of like project is very limiting. There's like so much more that could be done. Like I even when I was installing this, I was like, but there's so much more I want to add. Like just like statistics of like what is the most common emotion overall, what are the most commonly associated words with a certain emotion, you know, like things like that, and even like thinking about are you guys familiar with Jonathan Harris's work at all? Okay, well, so he does he does really cool visualization work, also kind of related to emotions and sort of that thing. So one of his projects, he showed emotions in terms of the weather and like compared it to a weather API. So like when it's raining, do people like blog more about sadness or something like that? So taking in other external data sources and comparing it to the messages over time would be interesting as well, for sure. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, do you have any like idea of like how this could be applied?
So the way that I did this, as someone who is new to coding, is very messy and sloppy. So it's not like code that like you could just take and put on another data set and be like, okay, it's done. Because I had to go through the data and fix it, and you know, there was so many steps to it that it's not something that can be recycled very easily. But this general concept, I think, as I mentioned before, could be related to therapeutic purposes and sort of like a way to visualize a person's progression over time. Because there's a lot of things that our personal data can tell us. And I think that there's not a lot of stuff or research right now that's really taking advantage of that, because I think there are privacy issues and people are scared of putting all of their messages ever into a database. So, but I think for sure that there is potential for therapeutic purposes and just like an analyzing yourself as a person. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a bit of a personal question. You don't have to answer it, but I am curious if this project has changed your relation with your sister. And have you looked at, for example, the correspondence between emotions, like being upset versus like a calm response, and and how that impacted the number of messages afterwards, something like that. So, just curious.
So some takeaways from this process was that we were messaging a lot while I was in school, and I don't know if it's because of the project or just the general stress of doing school, but she's sort of like someone that I confide in a lot. So I think at first she was apprehensive about it, and it didn't change the way that we messaged, but she like at first was kind of scared, and then at the installation, I think she really enjoyed going through it, like because it is sort of just like a story of growing up together, and sort of seeing our lives in this format was definitely like an interesting way to see it. So I don't know, I think she in some ways she's still kind of scared of it, and in other ways she's kind of proud of it. So.
You should just make an API and sell it to Facebook.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, so were you still collecting data, like did you start collecting data including the time that you knew you were doing the project? So was there a time when you knew what you were doing and still, okay, so did you have like communications that you took outside of Facebook? Okay, so you kept everything there.
Well, so it's sort of natural the way that we communicate. So sometimes we send a bunch of Snapchats to each other, and it's like silly and not important. But usually we're on Facebook because since I'm in Canada and she's still in New York State, it's sort of like it's like the WeChat or what, I don't know what else it is, other stuff. But yeah, so it's just, it makes sense for us to communicate that way. So yeah.
Sorry, if we have more questions, we can take it offline because we have only 5 minutes left of the 15 that I allocated for the break. Thank you so much, Sana.